Hello beauties, hope you're doing fabulous. You all wanted me to dupe Fuji palette from Nomad, so let's jump in. Beauties, as always, I'm gonna go row by row, top to bottom, left to right, swatching every single shade and telling you what single I'm using. For some of these, I'm gonna also give you alternative options. Let's get started. For our first shade, I picked Lost Princess from Sydney Grace. Although this shade might look like it is kind of cool toned in the pan, in the swatches it looks pretty warm toned. So this shimmery red with a golden shift looked like a great dupe. For our next shade, I picked Picking Peaches from Sydney Grace. This one is a pinky, a little bit peachy, cool toned, a little bit mauvey shade. You know how much I love Sydney Grace mattes. Our next shade looks like an iridescent multichrome with a beautiful blue shift, and for it I picked Snow Globe from Terra. Snow Globe has a prominent tealy blue shift, but then from some angles it turns into a gold shift. Let me see if I can catch the gold shift for you all. I think you can see the gold shift there. It's not easy to find a light-toned, cool yellow shade, which is our next one. And for it, I picked Mellow Yellow from Sydney Grace. This is a great shade for the inner corner or for blending the crease. And beauties, remember that the purpose of these dupe videos is to encourage you to use the makeup you already own instead of feeling the need to buy every new palette that's releasing. But of course, I understand that this is a very beautiful palette, so if you absolutely have to have it, I'm happy for you if you want to go and buy it. For our next shade, I have two options: Margarit from Looxi Beauty and Hidden Treasures from Sydney Grace. These are kind of distinct shade, and depending on what kind of effect you want, you can use one or the other. I swatched them together so that you can see how they compare. Margarit I've used in a lot of palettes before, and as you can see, it's a gorgeous golden shade with a shift of green. So if that's the effect you're going for, definitely use this shade. It would go very well with those tealy green shades in the palette. But if you want something a little bit more diffused, kind of romantic for your inner corner or for across the lid, Hidden Treasures is a fantastic option. I love the diffused shifts of this shade. Although you can't get your hands on Looxi Beauty anymore at this point, at least at some odd angles, Margaret has a pink shift, and I figured I should capture it for you all. Our next shade, I also picked two options. This is a beautiful burgundy. Now, if you want to do a little bit more cool toned, you can pick Looxi Beauty's Violicious, but of course, it's very difficult / impossible to get your hands on Looxi these days if you don't already own this shade. Another option that I picked is a shade from my Fairytale Ferries palette from Simply Posh. And as you can see, it's very clear that this shade has never been used. Yes, beauties, because I dupe a lot of palettes, I use already made palettes significantly less. But the beauty of these palettes that have magnetic pans is that I can pull them out and use the shades in my own custom-made palettes. And that's another thing I want to encourage you all to do. Also, beauties, remember that these shades always look a little bit deeper in person than what shows up on camera. For our next shade, I chose Jaded from Devinah. This is a beautiful mid-toned teal matte. For our next shade, I picked three options depending on what kind of shade you want in this spot of your palette. Our first option is from Fairytale Ferries, and this one has a very obvious blue tone. Our next option is a Sydney Grace matte that is a very light green. And the last option is from Berry Icy palette. You can probably guess it from the embossing, and it's essentially just a light toned teal. And here are the swatches next to each other so that you can compare them and you can decide which one would work for you depending on what kind of looks you want to go for with this palette. You can see that all of these shades are pretty pastel. Our next shade is another teal matte, but a deep toned one. And for this one, I picked Thrilled from Sydney Grace, which is one of my favorite teal matte singles. But beauties, teal mattes is also something very commonly found in different palettes. So don't forget to repurpose some of the magnetic palettes you might already own. Exercise made me realize I don't own a lot of bright yellow single mattes. I also don't think these shades exist a lot in palettes. Somebody was telling me the other day that yellow does not look good on everybody, so maybe that's the reason. This is Sweet Spot, a single from Colourpop. I've mentioned the difficulties of finding true red matte shades and the fact that I don't own many of them. I mentioned one of them in the video where I duped Vamp palette. I'll tag that if you want to check that out. So that is another option you could use. This one is a little cool toned and it's from the Best Matte palettes of Bella Beauté Bar. Although the shade in the palette looks a little deeper than this one, I wanted this shade to be kind of distinct from the shade right above it in the palette. The next shade in the palette looks like a tealy shimmer and arguably could be a very special shifty shade. For this one, I picked 3 options depending on which kind of a shift you want. You can pick one of these. The first one is Artemis from Terra, which arguably is a duochrome. Our next one is Moontide from Terra, which is definitely a multichrome. And the last option is Dark Waters from Looxi Beauty, which is actually purple. I thought this one went really well in this spot of the palette and that it would look gorgeous with those burgundies and reds. Artemis has a deep teal base with a beautiful greeny goldy shift on top. Moontide has a gorgeous, gorgeous purple base with a teal to blue to gold shift on top. And Dark Waters has a beautiful purple base with a very prominent blue shift on top. Very sad to see Looxi Beauty go because these shades were amazing at $3 a piece. And even from some angles, you might kind of see a pink shift with Dark Waters. Here are 3 options for our next shade depending on what kind of shift you're going for. You can use Big Bang from Looxi Beauty if you own it. Godess from Glam Shop is another option that's a bit more warm toned. It doesn't have the pinky shift. Or Bubble Fizz from Devinah is another fantastic option, and frankly, you can't go wrong with either of these. Big Bang is the one I chose for my palette because based on the swatches available on Nomad's website, this looked most like the shade in the palette. This one has a beautiful blue shift that will go amazing with those teal shades. Bubble Fizz from Devinah is from the Carnival Sweets collection. I don't have swatches of Carnival Sweets, although I have a lot of my Devinah collections swatched. Let me know if you want me to post swatches of this collection as well. I have the whole collection. These are the 2 options I chose for our next shade. The first one is Atlantis from Looxi Beauty, which is a beautiful duochrome shimmer. And then we have Into the Ocean from Terra. Here you can see that Atlantis has a very beautiful deep blue base with a gorgeous layer of silver on top, and Into the Ocean is a beautiful jewel toned deep blue shimmer. And our last shade is a matte orange, and this was another one that I had a hard time duping. And this one is another one that I picked from the Best Matte Palettes of Bella Beauté Bar. I realize I don't have a lot of orange mattes in my collection or oranges overall in my collection. I also don't own any monotone orange palettes, like for example the Orange You Glad palette from Colourpop. I didn't buy that palette because it has a glitter shade in it. But if you own that palette or any similar magnetic palette, you can pick a shade from one of those palettes to dupe this one. And beauties, that's it for the dupe of this palette. Remember that I have done some eye looks with this palette. I'm linking all of them in the description box below if you are curious to see what eye looks I made. If you're enjoying these kinds of dupe palettes, you can check out my duping playlist. I love you all, and until next time, bye!